something that he wouldn't. I lived with him till my wife died in 1958, his mother, which we had been married for 20.
He watched Elvis become a star, but he also watched him fall apart. To the world, Vernon Presley was simply Elvis's father, but behind closed doors he was something else, a silent observer to the life his son tried so hard to hold together. He saw the love, the loneliness, the glamour, and the grief. And when it came to Elvis's marriage to Priscilla, Vernon didn't just witness it, he carried the weight of it. What Vernon shared in his later years wasn't headline gossip. It was personal, quiet, the kind of truth you only tell when the cameras stop rolling. He spoke about the things he noticed, the little moments, the private conversations, the warning signs everyone else missed. Vernon may not have been a flashy man, but he remembered everything, especially the pain his son never showed on stage. For years, the public saw Elvis and Priscilla as the fairy tale couple, the king and his queen, living in a mansion smiling for the cameras. But according to Vernon, that story left out the most important part. The part where Elvis struggled to balance love with fame. The part where being Elvis Presley came at the cost of being a husband. And the part where no amount of talent or money could save a marriage slowly breaking from the inside. This isn't a scandal. It's a father's heartbreak. In the chapters ahead, we're going to share the side of the story rarely told. From a man who stood just off stage while history played out. Vernon didn't have all the answers, but he saw enough to understand where it all went wrong. This is his version of the love story, the one the tabloids never printed. It started, like many great love stories, with a chance meeting in a faraway place. Germany, 1959. Elvis Presley was stationed overseas for military service, and Priscilla Beaulieu was just a 14-year-old girl living on a nearby base. She was young, quiet, and stunning, with a calm presence that caught even Elvis's attention. Back home, Vernon Presley was getting updates through letters and phone calls. He could tell something was shifting in his son. Elvis wasn't just talking about the pressures of being away or the burden of fame. He was talking about a girl, one who made him feel grounded. That name, Priscilla, started to come up more and more. When Vernon finally met her, he was polite, warm, but observant. She carried herself well for someone so young, but that's what worried him. The age gap, the attention, the lifestyle she'd be walking into, it wasn't just a relationship, it was a transformation. And Vernon knew all too well how quickly the Presley world could chew someone up. Still, Elvis was determined. When he came back to the States, he stayed in touch with Priscilla. And eventually, he convinced her to move to Memphis. Vernon remembers that period vividly. Graceland was full of excitement, a new chapter beginning. But even then, the cracks had started to form. Elvis wanted the perfect love, Vernon once said, but he also wanted the life he had before her. That was the tension no one ever really talked about. Elvis was trying to have it both ways, a quiet, devoted partner at home, and the freedom to be the king everywhere else. In public, they looked flawless. Pictures of them at Graceland, smiling on the front steps, laughing with Lisa Marie in their arms. But Vernon saw what the cameras didn't. The nights Elvis wouldn't come home. The arguments whispered behind bedroom doors. The way Priscilla's smile slowly started to fade. And still, Vernon hoped they could make it work. He admired Priscilla, her patience, her loyalty, her commitment to family. But he also saw how hard it was for her. She was in love with the man, he'd later say, but married to the image. It was never just about infidelity or fame. It was about expectation. The crushing weight of what everyone thought their marriage should be versus what it really was behind the gate. Vernon saw his son wrestle with that every day. Elvis loved being a husband, but he also loved being Elvis. And those two identities were never fully at peace. The more successful he became, the harder it was to come back to the quiet reality of home life. Vernon once described it as watching a man run toward two different lives and losing pieces of himself in both. He saw the pressure build, the long tours, the film shoots, the fan hysteria. Elvis wasn't just busy, he was exhausted. And yet he still tried to give Priscilla moments of real love, private getaways, surprise gifts, late-night talks, but the cracks were widening, and Vernon, more than anyone, knew what was coming. "I saw my son trying to be in love," he said, "and also trying to stay Elvis." It wasn't that he didn't love Priscilla, it was that the version of him she needed was fading. By the time most people realized something was wrong, Vernon had already known for years. By the early 70s, things inside Graceland looked polished on the outside, but inside, Vernon Presley saw the tension building. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't explosive, it was something quieter, slower, more painful, and it came in waves. Vernon noticed Elvis becoming more withdrawn. At first, he thought it was just fatigue from touring, but soon he realized it was deeper. Elvis was tired, yes, but also frustrated, restless, and emotionally worn thin. Vernon once said, "There's a kind of loneliness that comes with being famous. My boy had all the noise but none of the peace." He remembered the late nights when Elvis wouldn't sleep. He'd sit at the piano tapping out gospel songs under his breath, or he'd walk the halls alone long after everyone else had gone to bed. Vernon would catch glimpses of that, those quiet moments when the king of rock and roll looked more like a boy lost in thought. At home, Priscilla was trying to hold things together. She managed the house, cared for Lisa Marie, kept up appearances, but Vernon could see the weight on her shoulders. She loved Elvis, but she also missed him, because even when he was physically there, emotionally, he was slipping away. The problem wasn't just the fame, it was that Elvis never learned how to turn it off. Even when he wasn't on stage, he was on. He had to be Elvis. The sunglasses, the charm, the aura, it followed him everywhere. And Vernon knew better than anyone that kind of pressure doesn't leave room for stillness, or vulnerability, or growth. Vernon once said Elvis wanted everything, music, movies, family, freedom, but he didn't know how to let go of any of it to protect what mattered most. That inner conflict started to show. Elvis became more irritable, more distracted. Vernon watched the conversations between Elvis and Priscilla grow shorter, tighter, less affectionate. There were no big blowout fights, just 1,000 little silences that grew louder over time. Priscilla, for her part, stayed graceful. Vernon respected that about her, but he also saw how lonely she looked some days. "She was waiting on a version of my son that couldn't come back," he'd later say. And Elvis, whether he knew it or not, was drifting. There were nights when Vernon would sit with his son, hoping to offer advice, quietly, without judgment. He'd say things like, "You can't keep living two lives, son," or "That girl in there's your wife, not a backup plan." Elvis would nod. Sometimes he'd agree, but the next day, everything would stay the same. One moment in particular stuck with Vernon. It was during a quiet evening when Elvis returned from a trip. Priscilla had made dinner. The house was calm. Vernon thought maybe, just maybe, it was a turning point. But Elvis barely spoke. He ate, went upstairs, and shut the door. That night, Vernon said, "I knew then." He wasn't just tired, he was emotionally checked out. And then came the rumors. Vernon started hearing whispers about other women, about time spent away from home, about Elvis growing colder. At first, he didn't want to believe it, but Elvis didn't deny it either. He just brushed it off. "It's complicated, Daddy," he'd say. "I still love her, but I don't know how to fix this." Vernon could see that Elvis wasn't being cruel on purpose. He wasn't out to hurt Priscilla, but he was lost. The pressure of being Elvis Presley had swallowed the man his wife had fallen in love with. And then came the moment Vernon didn't see coming. Priscilla had met someone else. Mike Stone, her karate instructor. When Elvis found out, Vernon was in the room. He remembered the stillness. Elvis didn't yell, he didn't throw anything, he just sat down. It hit him like a brick wall, Vernon said. He'd been slipping for so long he never thought she'd walk away. That moment changed everything. Elvis wasn't just hurt, he was shocked. And beneath the pride, Vernon saw something heartbreaking. His son realizing he'd lost the one person who tried the hardest to stay. After that, Elvis began to pull back. He still performed, still worked, still showed up for fans. But Vernon saw the spark was dimming. He smiled for the world, he said, but there wasn't much light left behind the eyes. In private, Vernon confronted him. "You gonna fix this?" he asked. Elvis just shrugged. "I don't know how." That was the most honest thing Vernon had ever heard his son say. To the public, Elvis and Priscilla were still a dream. But Vernon knew better. He saw a man trying to hold on to a life that was already slipping through his fingers. And deep down, he feared the worst was yet to come. It wasn't the kind of news any father wants to hear. Vernon Presley had lived long enough to know that relationships, especially ones lived out in the harsh glare of fame, often frayed over time. But when he learned that Priscilla had been involved in an affair after her separation from Elvis, it cut deeper than he expected. Not because of betrayal, but because of what it meant for his son. Vernon had always tried to stay out of Elvis and Priscilla's private life. He'd seen their marriage from close range, the whirlwind romance, the distance that followed Elvis's long stretches on the road, and the loneliness Priscilla often felt living at Graceland. Isolated, more a figure in Elvis's world than a partner in it. Still, when he found out that Priscilla had been with another man, it brought a flood of conflicting emotions. "I wasn't angry with her," Vernon would later say. "I could understand it in a way. She'd been alone for so long, even while she was with Elvis. But understanding didn't make it easier. When Elvis found out, it wasn't a storm. It wasn't shouting or rage. It was silence." That's what Vernon remembered most. The kind of silence that creeps into a room and swallows all the air. "He just shut down," Vernon said, like somebody turned off the light inside him. The king of rock and roll, the man who had moved millions with his voice, electrified audiences with a shake of his hips and a smile, was suddenly unreachable. For all his power on stage, Elvis was fragile in the quiet moments. And this was one of the quietest. Vernon saw it unfold firsthand. "I walked into his room that night and he was sitting on the bed. Just sitting there, staring at the floor, didn't even look up. For a long time, Vernon thought Elvis might explode, but instead something even more painful happened. He cried," Vernon said, his voice softening at the memory. "Not out of anger, not even really out of sadness. It was like he knew it was over, and he couldn't fix it." It was a side of Elvis few people had ever seen. Not the showman, not the star, but the boy from Tupelo who still hadn't figured out how to be alone. Vernon said something then that would haunt him for years. "My son never learned to be alone, and he always was." Those words stayed with him, and they cut deeper as Elvis began to spiral. After Priscilla left, the cracks in Elvis's armor widened. He withdrew from the world more than ever. The long nights at Graceland became longer, and the laughter that once filled the house turned into late-night laments and shadowed whispers. Drugs became more than just a way to sleep or take the edge off. They became a refuge. Food, isolation, erratic routines, all of it was part of a pattern now, and Vernon saw it helplessly from the sidelines. He didn't want to go out, didn't want to record, didn't want to talk much. The only thing he still did was sing, and even that was different. It was as if Priscilla's departure wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the unraveling of a man who had wrapped his identity around a life that no longer existed. Some friends tried to pull him out of it. Others gave up. Vernon, always the loyal father, stayed close, but even he couldn't reach the places where Elvis was retreating. He started depending on things, on people, on pills, on the past. I think a part of him hoped it was just a bad dream he'd wake up from. But it wasn't. The affair wasn't the cause of everything that followed, but it was the turning point. It forced Elvis to face a truth he had long avoided, that fame, love, and legacy couldn't fill the void he carried inside. That loneliness wasn't just something he felt, it was something that had shaped him from the very beginning. Vernon often wondered if things could have been different. If Elvis had learned how to be alone without feeling abandoned, if he'd seen that love sometimes meant letting go. But he never voiced those thoughts aloud. It didn't seem fair or helpful. What he did do, though, was remember. And in those memories, there was always that one moment, that quiet night, that broken silence. Elvis didn't cry because he lost her, Vernon once said. He cried because he knew she was the last person who really knew him, and she was gone. In the quiet years that followed Elvis's death, Vernon Presley carried more than grief. He carried guilt. A father's kind. The kind that lingers in the spaces between what was and what might have been. "I saw it all," Vernon once said, "and I couldn't stop it." He had watched his son rise from dirt roads in Tupelo to global stages, from the innocence of youth to the weight of fame. He'd been there through the music, the mania, the marriages, and the mistakes. And through it all, he stayed close, but never quite close enough to change the ending. Elvis and Priscilla, in spite of everything, remained bonded. They shared a daughter, a history, and a kind of love that never fully vanished. But Vernon always believed the damage was done, that whatever held them together had been cracked in a way that could never be made whole again. The hardest part for Vernon wasn't just losing Elvis, it was watching the emotional toll his son endured long before the end. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the way he poured every ounce of love into his audience, but couldn't seem to keep any for himself. Vernon tried to speak his truth in the years after. Not the myth, not the headlines, just the truth of a father watching his son crumble under the weight of who the world expected him to be. Some listened, many didn't, but Vernon kept telling it anyway, because it mattered, because Elvis mattered. "I was proud of my son," Vernon said in one of his last interviews, his voice weathered with loss and time. "But I wish he'd known how to love himself the way he loved the stage." Those words hang in the air, soft but heavy, like the final note of a song that never really ended. If this story touched your heart, take a moment with us to remember the man behind the myth. Elvis Presley wasn't just a music icon, a cultural phenomenon, or the king of rock and roll. He was also a deeply emotional, complicated man, someone who carried immense pressure, battled loneliness, and sought connection in a world that often saw only his fame. And behind him stood Vernon Presley, a father who loved his son fiercely, even when he couldn't save him. This chapter of Elvis's life, the heartbreak, the unraveling, the quiet pain that so few ever saw, is a story worth telling. Not because it's sensational, but because it's real. Because it reminds us that even the most celebrated lives can carry unbearable weight behind the curtain. If you believe the world needs more of these stories, more truth, more humanity, we invite you to be part of that mission. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who still loves Elvis or who might need to be reminded that vulnerability isn't weakness. Comment below. What part of Vernon's reflections hit you the hardest? What does Elvis mean to you beyond the music? And if you want more untold stories, the raw, heartfelt kind that go deeper than tabloid headlines, make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We'll be sharing more moments, more memories, and more truths from those who knew him best. Because remembering Elvis isn't just about his voice, his moves, or his legacy. It's about remembering the man, the father, the son, the human being. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for helping us keep Elvis's true story alive.